My daughter was about to marry a man the entire family adored. A brilliant, flawless financial consultant who seemed like the absolute answer to all our prayers. But right in the middle of their lavish engagement party in Lake Tahoe, the perfect illusion shattered. The champagne was flowing, a smooth jazz band was playing in the corner, and I was just raising my glass of scotch for a toast when I felt cold fingers dig into my arm. Hard. It was my daughter, Harper. Her face was the color of pale ash. Without saying a word, she pulled me away from the laughter, dragging me into a dark, quiet corridor near the service kitchens. Her hands were shaking so violently she could barely hold her phone. She shoved the glowing screen into my chest and whispered, her voice cracking with pure terror. "Dad, look at this. Something is seriously wrong with the family trust." I forced myself to smile at a group of passing guests, nodding politely until they were out of earshot. But inside, the cold, hard instincts of a man who spent his entire life fighting for survival immediately kicked in. If you have ever been stabbed in the back by someone sitting at your own dinner table, hit the like button right now. Tell me in the comments where you are watching, from what city, what state, and let us dive straight into this nightmare. I am 75 years old. For 40 of those years, I woke up at 4 in the morning to brave the brutal, unforgiving Chicago winters. I was a structural engineer and a commercial builder. I laid heavy bricks, poured wet concrete, and fought with stubborn foremen to build a legitimate company from absolute nothing. Standing in that dim hallway, I looked down at my own hands. They are heavily scarred, thick, and permanently calloused. These are the hands that built a financial fortress to protect my family from the harsh realities of the world. And now I was standing inside a 5-star luxury resort, overlooking the pristine moonlit waters of Lake Tahoe, surrounded by wealthy people in custom-tailored suits and expensive evening gowns. It was a completely different world. A world that Preston Caldwell, my future son-in-law, naturally belonged to. He had easily convinced us to host the rehearsal dinner at this exclusive venue. He knew all the right vintage wines, he charmed all the right people, and he possessed a practiced, brilliant smile that could easily disarm a striking rattlesnake. I had trusted him. We all had. I looked down at Harper's phone again, squinting in the low light. The screen displayed an automated high-priority security alert from our primary wealth management portal. It was just a single line of text, but it hit me harder than a falling steel beam. Trust control transferred. Authorization complete. My breath caught in my throat. That family trust was not just an account with money sitting in it. It was the complete liquidation of 4 massive commercial properties I had built from the dirt up over my entire career. It was the culmination of my life's work. More importantly, it was the permanent medical safety net for my wife Diane. I stepped slightly out of the dark shadow of the hallway and peered back into the grand ballroom. Across the sea of laughing faces, moving waiters, and sparkling crystal chandeliers, I saw her, my beautiful Diane. She was sitting gracefully in her specialized wheelchair, wearing a deep blue dress, her face illuminated by pure joy. She has been battling severe multiple sclerosis for the past 5 years. Physical pain is a daily constant companion for her, but tonight she was absolutely glowing. She was watching Preston entertain a group of our oldest relatives, believing with all her heart that our little girl was safe, financially secure, and deeply loved. I felt a massive lump form in my throat. I could not ruin this night for her. I would not let Diane's rare, beautiful smile fade because of a terrifying digital notification. I refused to let her panic in a room full of 200 guests. The rage building inside my chest was a living, breathing thing. Every instinct I had wanted me to march right back into that lavish room, grab Preston Caldwell by his expensive silk tie, drag him out onto the terrace, and demand answers in front of everyone he was trying to impress. I wanted to break his perfect jaw. But you do not survive 4 decades in the cutthroat Chicago construction business by throwing emotional tantrums. You survive by reading the structural integrity of a situation, finding the hidden weak point, and striking only when the timing is absolutely perfect. I took a long, deep breath, forcing my racing heart rate to slow down. I turned back to my daughter. Harper was crying now, silent, heavy tears ruining her expensive bridal makeup. She looked like a terrified little girl again. She confessed, her voice barely a whisper, that Preston had given her a thick stack of tax update documents to sign the day before. He had kissed her forehead and assured her it was just routine marital paperwork, conveniently handled and stamped by his own cousin, who happened to be a licensed notary. She had signed away everything without reading the fine print, blinded by love and absolute trust. I reached out and pulled Harper into a tight, protective hug, feeling her tremble violently against my chest. I spoke in a low, steady voice that left absolutely no room for argument. I told her to go to the ladies' room. I told her to wash her face, fix her makeup, and walk back into that party looking like the happiest bride in the entire world. I told her to act like absolutely nothing was wrong. She looked up at me terrified and asked what I was going to do. I simply told her that her father was going to handle it. I smoothed the lapels of my dark suit jacket, took one last calming breath in the shadows, and walked purposefully back into the bright, blinding lights of the ballroom. I did not look at my wife, knowing my eyes would give away the panic. Instead, I walked straight over to the private bar. I politely ordered 2 heavy glasses of neat scotch. I turned around the cold glasses in my calloused hands and locked my eyes directly on Preston. He was laughing loudly at a joke, looking like the undisputed king of the world, completely unaware that the old man he was trying to rob had just caught the scent of blood. I gripped the heavy crystal glasses, pasted a calm, welcoming smile onto my face, and started walking slowly toward him. The game was on. I navigated through the elegant, bustling crowd, the 2 heavy crystal glasses of Scotch cold against my palms. My heart hammered against my ribs, but my face was a mask of relaxed, fatherly pride. Preston stood near the glass doors leading to the terrace, holding court, with friends from my Rotary Club. He looked impeccable in a tailored charcoal suit, his posture effortlessly confident. This was the man who had supposedly graduated near the top of his class at Dartmouth, the brilliant financial mind who had promised to protect my daughter and our family legacy. I approached him, extending one of the glasses toward his chest. He turned his face, breaking into that familiar smile that charmed my wife the day they met. I asked if he had a moment to step onto the balcony for a quiet drink. He agreed instantly, clapping a warm hand on my shoulder as he excused himself from the guests. We stepped out into the crisp mountain air. The glass doors slid shut behind us, muting the jazz band and the chatter of the party. The stone balcony offered a sweeping view of the dark lake below, reflecting moonlight like shattered glass. We were completely alone in the freezing night. I took a slow sip of scotch, letting the harsh burn of alcohol steady my nerves. I looked out at the water for a long moment before turning back to him. I kept my voice perfectly casual, almost conversational, masking the venom in my throat. I told him Harper just showed me an alarming notification on her phone about the family trust being transferred. I watched his eyes closely, looking for a micro-expression of panic or a nervous twitch. I looked for anything that would betray guilt. There was absolutely nothing. Preston did not flinch. He did not break eye contact. In fact, his smile just softened into a look of patient understanding. He took a relaxed sip of his drink and leaned casually against the stone railing. He chuckled softly, shaking his head as if dealing with a completely harmless misunderstanding. He told me he had been expecting me to ask about that notification, apologizing sincerely for the automated alert scaring Harper. His voice was incredibly smooth, carrying that polished tone he used in boardrooms to command absolute trust. He launched into a highly technical, flawlessly delivered explanation. He explained that pending legislative changes were about to trigger a massive 20% capital gains tax on liquid assets held in family trusts. To shield our life savings, he claimed he initiated a strategic transfer of the primary assets into a holding company based in Delaware. He used complex financial jargon with the effortless ease of a seasoned professor. He talked at length about tax loopholes, corporate veils, and generational asset preservation. He assured me this was a completely standard maneuver for high net worth portfolios that would ultimately save our family hundreds of thousands of dollars. He placed a comforting hand on my arm and sighed heavily. He said he personally emailed me the legal prospectus and transfer authorization forms last week for review. He gently suggested Harper was simply suffering from pre-wedding anxiety, drastically overreacting to a standard notification, because her nerves were completely frayed from planning. He painted himself as the diligent protector of our wealth, and my daughter as a highly emotional bride making a mountain out of a harmless molehill. It was a masterful performance. If I had been any other man, I would have thanked him right then and there. I would have patted his back, praised his Ivy League education, and walked happily back inside to enjoy the rest of the evening. And that is exactly what I pretended to do. I let my shoulders slump slightly, exhaling a long breath, as if a massive weight had just been lifted off my chest. I gave him a sheepish, self-deprecating smile. I played the precise role of the tired, out-of-touch construction worker who was simply overwhelmed by the dizzying complexities of modern wealth management. I thanked him profusely for watching out for us. I told him my email inbox was always a terrible mess, and I must have missed the documents. I apologized deeply for doubting his intentions, even for a single second. I watched his ego swell. The faint glint of triumph in his dark eyes confirmed he bought my act completely. He truly believed he had successfully outsmarted the clueless old man. We clinked our heavy glasses together in the cold night air, sealing the invisible lie between us. I excused myself, claiming the crisp mountain breeze was getting to my joints. I walked straight back through the crowded ballroom, my warm smile fixed in place, heading toward the bank of elevators. The exact moment the elevator doors closed, shielding me from the party, my fake smile vanished entirely. I went straight up to my hotel suite and firmly locked the door behind me. I did not turn on the overhead lights. I walked swiftly over to the desk, flipped open my laptop, and accessed my email. Sure enough, buried in my cluttered inbox was a message from Preston, from 4 days ago, containing a thick PDF attachment. I opened the digital document. To a normal layman, it looked completely legitimate and professional. It had official-looking letterheads, dense paragraphs of legal clauses, and perfectly formatted signature lines. But I was not a normal layman. I had spent 40 brutal years reading complex architectural blueprints, finding microscopic flaws that could bring down an entire commercial skyscraper. I scrolled past the dense legal jargon and zoomed in closely on the banking transfer details located at the very bottom of the final page. My eyes locked onto the 9-digit bank routing number. I felt a cold spike of absolute dread pierce directly through my chest. The expensive legal documents looked completely flawless, but my veteran contractor eyes caught one tiny, devastating flaw. I stared at the screen until my vision blurred the faint glow illuminating the dark suite. The 9-digit routing number listed under the receiving institution did not match any standard domestic financial registry I was familiar with. Over the years, I had dealt with dozens of banks, credit unions, and private lenders across the United States to fund my construction projects. You learn to recognize the geographical prefixes of American routing numbers. This sequence began with a string of digits that felt entirely alien. I glanced at the digital clock on the nightstand. It was exactly 2 a.m. The resort was dead silent save for the muffled rhythmic crashing of the lake water against the distant shoreline. My wife Diane was sound asleep in the adjoining bedroom, her soft breathing barely audible through the cracked door. I needed answers, and I needed them immediately. I reached for my cell phone, pulled up the emergency 24-hour customer service line for our primary wealth management firm, and dialed. The automated voice system was a maze of frustrating prompts, clearly designed to test the patience of anyone calling at this ungodly hour. I pressed 0 repeatedly, my thumb hitting the glass screen with mounting aggression, until the sterile robotic voice finally gave way to the weary tone of a night shift representative. He introduced himself as Marcus. I gave him my name, my primary account number, and my secure verbal passcode. I kept my voice incredibly low, almost a whisper, to avoid waking Diane. I told Marcus I was reviewing a recent high-level transfer authorization and needed immediate verification on the destination routing number. I read the 9 digits to him slowly, deliberately making sure he heard every single number. I heard the rapid clicking of his keyboard through the receiver. Then there was a long, heavy pause. It was the kind of silence that precedes a doctor delivering a terminal diagnosis. The kind of silence that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand straight up. Marcus cleared his throat. His professional customer service tone had vanished, replaced by a slight, undeniable hesitation. He asked me if I was absolutely certain about the numbers I had just provided. I confirmed I was reading them directly from the finalized transfer document. Marcus took a deep breath. He explained that the routing number I had given him did not belong to a domestic holding company in Delaware. In fact, it did not belong to any financial institution within the borders of the United States. He told me it was an international transit code assigned to a private offshore banking facility located in the Cayman Islands. Specifically, it was an unregulated shadow account, the kind typically used for completely untraceable wire transfers and anonymous wealth concealment. The phone felt like a block of lead in my hand. The air in the hotel suite suddenly grew thick and suffocating. I thanked Marcus mechanically, told him I would follow up in the morning, and ended the call. I sat alone in the dark, the horrifying truth washing over me like a bucket of ice water. Preston Caldwell was not shielding our assets from a new capital gains tax. He was stealing them. He was methodically siphoning the entire financial foundation of my family into an offshore black hole where I would never be able to reach it. 40 years of my life. 4 decades of breathing in concrete dust, negotiating with ruthless city inspectors, and sacrificing my own physical health to build a lasting legacy. It was all being quietly funneled away by a man wearing a $5,000 suit who had smiled in my face and called me Dad just an hour ago. My hands began to shake, not from fear, but from a profound volcanic rage. This was not just a theft. This was an act of absolute destruction. Without that trust, Diane's specialized medical care would be completely compromised. Without those funds, the 4 commercial buildings in Chicago that I still owned outright could become vulnerable to property tax defaults. He was not just robbing my bank account. He was attempting to tear down my entire life's work. I closed the laptop softly. There would be no sleep tonight. I spent the next 4 hours sitting in the dark, watching the digital clock slowly tick forward. I methodically reviewed every interaction I had ever had with Preston, every smooth excuse, every polished lie. I had been a fool to trust the veneer of perfection. But a fool can always learn, and an old contractor knows exactly how to stop a leak before the foundation collapses. I just needed to act with absolute precision. Slowly, the pitch-black sky outside my window began to turn a bruised shade of purple, then a pale, cold blue. Morning had arrived. It was the day before my only daughter was supposed to walk down the aisle. I stood up, my joints aching in protest, and walked into the bathroom to splash freezing water on my face. I looked at my reflection in the mirror. I did not look like a helpless victim. I looked like a man preparing for war. I quietly put on a fresh shirt, tied my shoes, and slipped my wallet into my pocket. My plan was simple and direct. I would drive down the mountain to the local Lake Tahoe branch of our wealth management firm the moment their doors opened. I would present my identification, bypass the digital portals, and order a complete freeze on every single account bearing my name. I would lock the vault from the inside before Preston could finalize his offshore transfers. I quietly slipped out of the hotel suite, leaving Diane to sleep. I walked to my rental car with absolute purpose. But I had no idea that the brilliant financial mind I was dealing with had already anticipated my every move. The trap had already been sprung. I pulled my rental car into the freshly paved parking lot of the local Tahoe branch just as the morning sun crested over the snow-capped mountain peaks. The heavy glass doors of the bank were just being unlocked by a uniformed security guard. I walked inside, my posture straight, and my face set in cold, unwavering determination. The interior was dead quiet, smelling of expensive roasted coffee and polished mahogany wood. I bypassed the standard customer teller line entirely and walked directly toward the large glass-enclosed office of the branch manager. I did not wait for an invitation or ask for permission to enter his workspace. I simply opened the heavy door, sat down in the plush leather guest chair, and placed my state identification firmly on his spotless desk. The manager, a young man with a neatly trimmed beard and a silver name tag that read Gregory, looked up in genuine surprise. I did not give him a single chance to offer me standard pleasantries or ask how my day was going. I spoke in a low, authoritative voice that commanded absolute obedience. I told him my name and instructed him to immediately freeze all outgoing transfers on my primary personal accounts and the family trust. I fully expected him to nod, type quickly on his computer keyboard, and secure my life savings. Instead, Gregory slowly leaned back in his chair. He did not touch his computer mouse. A strange, highly uncomfortable expression washed over Gregory's face. It was not the crisp, efficient professionalism I was accustomed to receiving from financial institutions over the past 40 years. It was sheer pity. He looked at me the way one might look at a lost, confused child wandering alone in a crowded shopping mall. He let out a soft, sympathetic sigh and gently pushed my identification card back across the polished wooden desk. He folded his hands together and spoke in a patronizingly soft tone. He told me that he could not honor my urgent request. He explained that my future son-in-law, Preston Caldwell, had personally visited this exact branch late yesterday afternoon. Preston had not come alone. He had brought a thick stack of legally binding documents, officially notarized and physically signed by my own daughter, Harper. My heart began to pound, a slow, incredibly heavy rhythm against my ribs, as Gregory opened a manila folder and turned a piece of paper around for me to clearly see. It was a comprehensive medical power of attorney. Gregory explained, his voice dripping with unbearable sympathy, that according to the medical paperwork filed, I had been legally declared mentally unfit to manage my own financial affairs due to rapid onset early-stage dementia. The word dementia echoed in the quiet office like a deafening gunshot. For a fraction of a second, the sheer audacity of the lie completely blinded me. I felt the kind of explosive, consuming rage that could easily level a city block. I am a man who built a commercial construction empire from absolute nothing. I have negotiated multi-million-dollar contracts, managed massive crews of hardened steelworkers, and navigated the most complex, unforgiving zoning laws in Chicago without ever breaking a single sweat. My mind is as sharp and unbreakable as a diamond. Yet here I was, sitting in a quiet, sterile office, being treated like a helpless, senile old man who had forgotten to take his morning medication. Preston had not just stolen my money. He had meticulously orchestrated the legal assassination of my own mental competence. He had weaponized my daughter's blind trust to strip me of my independence before I even knew we were fighting a war. Every muscle in my body tensed. I desperately wanted to reach across the desk, grab the collar of Gregory's expensive dress shirt, and roar that I was perfectly sane. I wanted to demand the local police be called immediately. I wanted to burn the entire building straight to the ground. But then the cold, calculating survival instincts of a veteran contractor took over. If I caused a scene right now, if I shouted and demanded legal action, I would only be playing perfectly into Preston's twisted narrative. An aggressive, paranoid, and confused outburst is exactly what early-stage dementia looks like to an untrained observer. Gregory would undoubtedly call bank security, and then he would call Preston to come collect his poor sick father-in-law. I would permanently lose the element of surprise, which was the absolute only weapon I had left in my arsenal. So I swallowed my massive pride. I took the bitter, humiliating pill and forced it down my throat. I let the rigid tension drain completely out of my shoulders. I intentionally allowed my weathered hands to shake slightly as they rested on my knees. I blinked rapidly, adopting a mask of gentle, innocent confusion. I looked down at the carpeted floor, then back up at Gregory, letting my voice waver just a fraction. I asked him, sounding completely lost and fragile, if I had already been to the bank earlier this week. I mumbled something about my memory being a little foggy lately, and how I just wanted to make sure my family was financially protected. Gregory's face softened even further. He gave me a sad, incredibly reassuring smile. He told me that everything was perfectly fine, that my loving family was taking excellent care of my complex assets, and that I did not need to worry about a single thing. He gently suggested that I return to the luxury resort and get some much-needed rest before the big wedding tomorrow. I thanked him profusely, playing the part of the grateful, forgetful elder to absolute flawless perfection. I slowly stood up, leaning slightly on his desk for support, and shuffled slowly out of his office. I walked through the bank lobby with the careful, measured steps of a frail, dying man. But behind my vacant eyes, a terrifying, absolute clarity had settled in. Preston had successfully locked the front door of the bank, but he had deeply underestimated the dangerous man he was trying to lock out. I pushed through the heavy glass doors and stepped back out into the freezing mountain air. I dropped the senile act the exact second I was clear of the bank's security cameras. My posture straightened, and my stride became powerful and purposeful again. I reached into my coat pocket to pull out my keys, casually scanning the parking lot as I walked toward my rental vehicle. That was when I saw it. Parked completely backward, in a spot near the exit, with a clear, unobstructed line of sight to the bank entrance, was a large black sport utility vehicle. It had heavily tinted windows and out-of-state license plates. The engine was idling quietly, a steady plume of white exhaust rising into the cold morning sky. I did not stop walking, and I did not turn my head to stare, but my eyes locked onto the dark windshield. Someone was sitting in the driver's seat, watching my every single move. Preston was not just a white-collar criminal hiding comfortably behind legal paperwork. He was a man who employed dangerous shadows to ensure his problems stayed contained. The trap was much deeper than a stolen trust fund. I was being actively watched, and the deadly game had officially escalated. I got into my rental vehicle, my movements deliberately slow and unsteady. I adjusted the rearview mirror, making sure I had a clear line of sight to the tinted windshield of the black sport utility vehicle. I started the engine and pulled out of the bank parking lot, merging onto the main road. The heavy vehicle pulled out 3 seconds later, keeping a disciplined distance of 2 car lengths behind me. The mountain roads surrounding Lake Tahoe are notoriously treacherous. They are winding steep and bordered by sharp drops that plunge into the freezing lake below. I kept my speed strictly to the posted limit, driving like a cautious, frightened elderly man would. Inside the cabin of my car, however, my mind was racing with absolute clarity. Whoever was behind the wheel of that dark vehicle was a highly trained professional. They did not tailgate aggressively. They just hovered like a silent predator, making sure I did not deviate from a predictable path straight back to the resort. I desperately needed to make a phone call, but doing so on my personal cell phone was out of the question. If Preston had the resources to forge federal banking documents and hire physical surveillance, tapping my personal device would be incredibly easy for him. About 10 miles up the scenic highway, I spotted a crowded roadside diner and gas station packed with morning tourists and heavy logging trucks. It was the perfect cover. I turned my blinker on early and pulled smoothly into the bustling parking lot, parking my car between 2 massive recreational vehicles. They blocked the line of sight from the main road. The black vehicle drove past the entrance, forced to circle back. I had a narrow window of perhaps 3 minutes to act. I reached deep into the compartment of my center console. Years ago, during a nasty union dispute on a commercial construction site in Chicago, I learned the importance of untraceable communication. I always kept a prepaid, unregistered cellular phone sealed in its original plastic packaging for emergencies. I tore the plastic open, powered the small device on, and quickly dialed a number I had committed to memory over a decade ago. The unlisted line rang twice before a gravelly, exhausted voice answered. It was Mitchell Thorne. Mitchell was not a private investigator who caught cheating spouses. He was a former federal forensic accountant who had left the government after realizing he preferred hunting financial predators without the restrictions of a badge. He was ruthless, incredibly brilliant, and possessed a profound hatred for white-collar criminals. I did not waste time with standard pleasantries. I told him I needed his specific set of skills immediately. Mitchell recognized the tension in my voice and asked what the target was. I gave him the name Preston Caldwell. I detailed the offshore routing number in the Cayman Islands, the forged medical power of attorney, declaring me mentally incompetent, and the black security vehicle currently hunting me in the parking lot. I heard the sharp scratch of a match over the receiver as Mitchell lit a cigarette. He let out a low whistle. He told me that a standard con artist steals a checkbook, but a man who sets up offshore transit accounts and hires private surveillance is playing the game in a completely different, dangerous league. I gripped the plastic phone tightly, staring at the diner entrance. I ordered Mitchell to dig into Preston's entire existence. I wanted every single digital footprint, every encrypted email, every hidden bank account, and every dirty secret this man had ever managed to bury. I told Mitchell to tear his pristine Ivy League facade completely apart and find the absolute truth of who was actually marrying my daughter tomorrow. Mitchell replied in a cold, confident tone that he would turn the man inside out before the sun set tonight. I ended the brief call, snapped the burner phone in half with my bare hands, and tossed the broken pieces into a nearby trash can overflowing with discarded coffee cups. I walked quickly into the diner, bought a black coffee, and walked back out to my rental car, just as the dark vehicle pulled slowly into the far edge of the busy lot. The driver saw me harmlessly holding my hot coffee flawlessly, playing the pathetic part of a tired old man desperately needing a morning caffeine fix. The delicate illusion remained perfectly intact. I pulled out of the parking lot and began the final slow descent back toward the luxury resort. The scenic drive back down the mountain took another agonizing 20 minutes. My mind was focused on the rapidly approaching battle. I pulled up to the grand front entrance of the sprawling resort, handing my keys over to the young valet with a trembling, confused smile. I physically adjusted my winter coat, intentionally, hunched my tired shoulders slightly forward, and walked slowly through the heavy glass doors directly into the bustling, opulent main lobby. The massive space was completely filled with frantic floral arrangers, loud wedding coordinators, and laughing family members happily preparing for the upcoming rehearsal activities. I deliberately kept my eyes fixed downward on the polished marble floor, fully committing to the tragic role of the frail, declining father. But as I approached the bottom of the grand staircase leading upward to the guest suites, a tall figure stepped directly into my narrow path, blocking my forward way. It was Preston. He looked immaculate in a perfectly tailored light gray morning suit, his dark hair perfectly styled. He wore a deeply concerned, warm smile that made my stomach completely churn. In his left hand, he held a small crystal glass filled with ice water. In the palm of his right hand rested a small, unfamiliar white pill. He reached out gently, placing a hand on my shoulder, and spoke in a voice loud enough for the passing guests to hear. "Dad, you forgot your blood pressure medication this morning." I stopped dead in my tracks, staring at the small white tablet resting innocently in the center of his perfectly manicured palm. My actual blood pressure medication was safely zipped inside my leather travel bag up in my room. I had already taken it at dawn before I left for the bank. Preston had absolutely no reason to have my prescription, and he certainly had no business administering it to me in the middle of a crowded hotel lobby. But his expression was an absolute masterclass in feigned concern. He looked exactly like a devoted, worried son, trying to care for his aging, confused father. A few passing guests even offered him warm, approving smiles. He was playing to the audience, cornering me in public, where any refusal or argument would just look like the paranoid ramblings of a man suffering from severe cognitive decline. My heart hammered furiously against my ribs, but I forced my facial muscles to relax into a look of vague, grateful surprise. I reached out with a trembling hand and picked up the pill. I thanked him, my voice adopting that same frail, wavering tone I had used with the bank manager just an hour ago. I told him my memory was playing tricks on me again, and I appreciated him keeping such a close eye on my health. I made a move to slip the pill into my coat pocket, claiming I would take it upstairs after I had something to eat. But Preston gently grabbed my wrist. His grip was firm, completely unyielding, contradicting the soft, affectionate smile on his face. He held the cold glass of water up to my chest. He gently insisted that Harper would be absolutely devastated if I suffered a medical emergency on the eve of her wedding. He was not going to let me leave his sight until he watched me swallow it. I looked directly into his dark, predatory eyes. I saw the absolute ruthlessness hiding just beneath his polished exterior. He wanted me docile. He wanted me chemically restrained and pliant for the next 24 hours so he could finish stealing my life. I nodded slowly, offering him a compliant, weary smile. I raised the pill to my lips and placed it on my tongue. I brought the heavy crystal glass to my mouth and took a long, exaggerated gulp of the freezing water. But as the liquid flooded my mouth, I used a trick I had learned decades ago. I quickly pushed the small tablet deep into the inner pocket of my left cheek, with my tongue pressing it firmly against my gum line. I swallowed loudly, making sure my throat bobbed in a highly visible manner. I handed the half-empty glass back to him, opened my mouth just wide enough to show it was empty, and wiped my lips with the back of my hand. I let out a long, satisfied sigh. Preston visibly relaxed. The tight tension around his shoulders completely vanished, replaced by a look of sheer, arrogant triumph. He patted my shoulder again, told me to go upstairs and take a restful nap, and promised he would handle all the rehearsal details. He turned and walked away, disappearing into the elegant crowd. I maintained my slow, shuffling pace until I reached the privacy of the elevator bank. The moment the steel doors closed, securing me inside the empty cabin, I leaned against the mirrored wall and spat the rapidly dissolving pill into the palm of my hand. The bitter, chalky chemical taste coated the inside of my mouth, making me gag slightly. I rode the elevator up to my floor, stepped out into the quiet hallway, and sprinted to my suite. I unlocked the door, rushed straight into the bathroom, and aggressively rinsed my mouth out with cold tap water until the terrible taste was completely gone. I dried my hands, walked over to the desk by the window, and carefully placed the damp white tablet onto a clean tissue. I pulled out a small magnifying glass I always carried for reading complex contract print and leaned over the pill. It was a generic-looking white circle, but there was a faint, distinct alphanumeric imprint stamped onto its surface. I pulled out my laptop, quickly connected to the encrypted hotel network, and typed the imprint code into a pharmaceutical identification database. The search results populated instantly, and my blood ran absolutely cold. It was not designed to manage blood pressure. It was a highly potent, fast-acting antipsychotic tranquilizer. It was the kind of heavy sedative typically administered to patients suffering from severe manic episodes or violent psychiatric breakdowns. A full dose of this medication would not just put me to sleep, it would completely incapacitate my central nervous system. It would leave me severely disoriented, unable to speak coherently, and physically incapable of standing on my own 2 feet. If I had actually swallowed that pill, Preston would have easily pointed to my slurred speech and severe confusion as undeniable proof of my rapidly advancing dementia. He could have wheeled me into a hospital, neutralizing the only person standing between him and my family's fortune. He was prepared to medically poison his own father-in-law just to keep his theft perfectly on track. I stared at the dissolving white poison on the tissue, feeling a dangerous calm wash over my entire body. I was fighting for my actual life and for my daughter, who was about to pledge her soul to a total monster. The sudden sharp vibration of my personal cell phone abruptly broke the heavy silence of the hotel suite. I jumped slightly. I picked up the black phone. The caller ID was blocked. I answered the call. When Mitchell finally spoke, his usually steady voice sounded strangely strained. He took a long, ragged breath. He said, "Richard, you need to sit down right now. The man marrying your daughter does not exist." I sank slowly onto the edge of the hotel bed. The mattress creaked softly under my weight, the only sound in the suffocating silence of the room. I gripped the black phone tightly, pressing the speaker hard against my ear. I asked Mitchell to repeat what he had just said, hoping my aging ears had somehow misunderstood his gravelly voice. But Mitchell did not stutter. He repeated the chilling sentence with absolute certainty. The flawless, charming financial consultant known as Preston Caldwell was nothing more than a carefully constructed ghost. Mitchell explained that he had started his intense investigation by pulling the Social Security number and academic records Preston had provided to our family during the early days of his relationship with Harper. On the surface, the digital footprint looked immaculate. The alumni directories, the previous corporate employment records at top-tier financial firms, and the glowing professional references were all seamlessly integrated into the public databases. But Mitchell possessed the unique ability to look behind the digital wallpaper. When he cross-referenced the Social Security number with historical property tax records and old hospital birth registries, the entire pristine facade instantly crumbled into absolute nothingness right before his eyes. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead. I asked Mitchell if he had managed to uncover the actual identity of the man sleeping under the same roof as my daughter. I heard the sharp, rapid click of a keyboard on his end. He told me the man's real name was Paul Sterling. Paul was not an Ivy League-educated wealth manager. He was a high-level grifter and a seasoned money launderer who had spent the last 10 years operating out of the murky, neon-lit criminal underworld of Miami, Florida. According to the sealed federal indictments, Mitchell had managed to hack into Paul, specialized in washing dirty cash through complex real estate transactions and offshore shell companies. He was incredibly good at his job, smooth enough to blend in with legitimate businessmen, and ruthless enough to deal with hardened criminals. But about 8 months ago, Paul made a catastrophic, unforgiving mistake. He got arrogant. He attempted to skim a massive percentage of a laundering operation for himself, funneling the stolen cash into a failed cryptocurrency venture that vanished completely overnight. The money Paul had carelessly lost did not belong to an insured bank or a naive corporate investor. It belonged to a notoriously violent narcotics cartel operating out of South America, with deep, bloody roots in the Miami port system. Mitchell paused, letting the heavy gravity of the situation fully settle over the phone line. He revealed that Paul currently owed the cartel exactly $8 million now. And these were not creditors who sent polite collection letters or negotiated payment plans. They were men who sent heavily armed professionals to quietly eliminate entire families. This explained the black sport utility vehicle waiting outside the bank. It explained the constant presence of unseen watchers around the resort. Paul was not just trying to steal my family fortune out of greed. He was a desperate, cornered rat fighting for his own physical survival. The cartel had given him a strict, non-negotiable deadline to repay the $8 million in full. That terrifying deadline was next week. Suddenly, every single confusing puzzle piece snapped perfectly into place. The incredibly rushed timeline for the wedding. The frantic, aggressive push to consolidate the family trust into an offshore account. The forged medical power of attorney designed to quickly neutralize me before I could ask dangerous questions, and the heavy tranquilizer he had just tried to force down my throat. Paul was completely out of time. He needed the marriage to happen tomorrow, so he could legally bind Harper to his financial decisions, instantly transforming our generational wealth into his personal lifeline. He was using my beautiful, innocent daughter as a human shield to pay off a massive blood debt to a ruthless crime syndicate. I felt a physical wave of nausea wash over my entire body. I told Mitchell that we had to call the federal authorities immediately. I declared we had enough evidence to have him arrested right there today. But Mitchell instantly shot the desperate idea down. His voice grew incredibly tense. He warned me that if the authorities arrested Paul now, the cartel would realize their money was gone. They would not simply cut their losses and quietly walk away. They would look directly at the man's new family. They would look at Harper, and they would look at me. We would be permanently marked. We needed a strategy that protected my family from the immediate fallout. I rubbed my tired eyes frantically, trying to calculate our remaining assets. I reasoned with Mitchell that the offshore trust transfer I had discovered earlier only contained around $4 million in liquid cash. That was absolutely everything we had saved, but it was still only half of what Paul owed the cartel. I asked Mitchell how Paul planned to come up with the remaining $4 million to save his own life before the deadline. A long, agonizing silence stretched across the phone line. I could hear Mitchell exhale a heavy stream of cigarette smoke. When he finally spoke again, his voice was laced with genuine dread. He told me I needed to brace myself. Paul had not just drained the liquid cash trust. Over the past month, he had secretly used the forged power of attorney and Harper's blind signature to aggressively leverage the physical assets I still owned. Mitchell had just pulled the county property records. Paul had taken out massive mortgages on my 4 buildings in Chicago. The loans had already been approved and fully funded using my completely spotless credit history. The $8 million was sitting in an escrow account ready to be wired directly to the cartel the moment the wedding was finalized. Preston was one signature away from destroying my family forever tonight. I hung up the phone and stared blankly at the wall of my hotel suite, the sheer magnitude of the impending disaster crashing over me. My mind immediately began to process the complex legal arithmetic of what Mitchell had just revealed. Tomorrow afternoon, when my beautiful daughter stood at the altar and said her vows, she would unknowingly step into a perfectly designed financial bear trap. In the eyes of the law, the moment they signed that marriage certificate, their lives would be legally bound. Harper's assets, including the massive trust she thought she was merely protecting, would instantly become shared marital property. But more terrifyingly so would his hidden catastrophic debts. Preston was not just marrying her for love or status. He was using the sacred institution of marriage as an impenetrable legal shield. He was planning to seamlessly absorb the 4 commercial buildings I had transferred to Harper's name, instantly liquidating them to satisfy the ruthless Miami cartel. He was going to use the innocent signature of a trusting bride to erase an $8 million blood debt, leaving our entire family completely destitute and permanently entangled with a violent criminal syndicate. Those 4 commercial buildings located in the heart of Chicago were not just abstract numbers on a financial spreadsheet. They were the physical embodiment of my entire existence. I closed my eyes and vividly remembered the brutal winter mornings in the late 1970s. I remembered the biting cold wind whipping off Lake Michigan as I stood on skeletal steel frames, my hands practically frozen to the heavy scaffolding. I remembered the endless disputes with stubborn city inspectors, the agonizing delays caused by union strikes, and the sheer physical exhaustion that settled deep into my bones every single night. I had laid the actual bricks of the foundational walls with my own calloused hands. I had poured the concrete slabs that formed the solid ground of those structures. Every single beam of steel and sheet of glass was paid for with my sweat, my chronic back pain, and my unwavering determination to provide a secure future for Diane and our little girl. Those buildings were my legacy. They were the protective fortress I had built to ensure my family would never have to experience the desperate, grinding poverty I had known as a young man. The thought of some slick, parasitic con artist handing the keys of my life's work over to a group of violent drug traffickers filled me with an indescribable, blinding fury. I would absolutely rather strike a match and burn all 4 of those buildings straight to the ground myself than let a single penny of my hard-earned money fall into the hands of a criminal syndicate. But blind rage would not win this war. If I simply stormed out of this room and confronted Preston now, he would deny everything. He would call bank security, or use the forged medical power of attorney to have me institutionalized immediately. He would tell Harper I was suffering from a severe manic episode brought on by my supposed dementia. I needed undeniable concrete proof. I needed the exact documents that proved he had fraudulently leveraged my properties. I needed the encrypted communications between him and his shadowy cartel handlers. I needed a weapon so sharp and undeniable that when I finally swung it, it would sever his absolute hold over my daughter permanently. Mitchell had informed me that the specific mortgage applications and the digital wire transfer instructions were highly sensitive. A seasoned money launderer like Paul Sterling would never leave a paper trail lying around in a physical briefcase. He would keep everything securely stored on his encrypted personal laptop. I had seen him carrying a sleek silver computer all weekend, aggressively guarding it like a precious child. He never let it out of his sight, taking it with him even when he went down to the resort lobby for a simple cup of coffee. That laptop contained the smoking gun. It held the digital blueprint of his entire criminal enterprise and the exact loan documents he planned to execute tomorrow. In order to save my daughter and my legacy, I had to gain unrestricted physical access to that machine. I needed enough time to insert a specialized bypass drive Mitchell had previously taught me how to use during a corporate espionage case years ago, and I needed to download every single file without triggering any internal security alarms. The problem was finding a moment where Preston would be completely separated from his device. I walked over to the large window of my suite and looked out over the sprawling resort grounds. Workers were busy setting up massive white tents and arranging elegant floral centerpieces near the edge of the lake. Tonight was the official rehearsal dinner for the wedding. It was scheduled to be a lavish formal affair, with over 200 guests in attendance. There would be endless rounds of champagne, lengthy toasts from distant relatives, and a heavily produced slideshow of the happy couple. Preston would be the absolute center of attention, forced to play the role of the perfect, charming groom for hours on end. He would be dressed in a custom tuxedo, surrounded by a sea of admiring friends and family members. More importantly, he would not be able to carry a silver laptop into a formal dining room without raising serious suspicion from Harper. He would be forced to leave it securely locked inside the heavy safe of his penthouse suite. That was my only realistic opening. I had to actually attend that formal dinner, smile at the man who was actively trying to destroy my life, and wait for the perfect moment to slip away unnoticed. The ticking clock was deafening in my ears. I had less than 12 hours to break into his penthouse and steal the evidence. My only chance to successfully retrieve those hidden files was during the rehearsal dinner tonight. The grand ballroom of the resort had been completely transformed for the evening rehearsal dinner. Massive crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over 200 seated guests. Waiters in immaculate white jackets moved silently between the round tables, pouring expensive champagne and serving plates of roasted prime rib. The atmosphere was incredibly festive, filled with the joyous sounds of clinking glasses and loud laughter. I sat at the head table next to my wife Diane, who looked absolutely radiant in her silk evening gown. To my left sat Harper, beaming with innocent happiness, her hand tightly intertwined with the man who was actively plotting to destroy us. Paul Sterling, wearing a custom-tailored midnight blue tuxedo, was playing his role as Preston Caldwell to absolute perfection. He charmed my elderly relatives, laughed at my brother's terrible jokes, and projected the image of a deeply devoted future husband. I ate my dinner mechanically, tasting absolutely nothing. My heart was pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs, but my exterior remained perfectly calm. I was waiting for my moment. When the plates were finally cleared, the clinking of a silver spoon against a glass brought the massive room to a respectful silence. It was time for the father of the bride to deliver the traditional toast. I stood up slowly, leaning heavily on the table for a moment to maintain the illusion of my frail health. I picked up my crystal flute of champagne and looked out over the sea of expectant faces. My eyes eventually locked directly onto the man sitting beside my daughter. I took a deep breath and began to speak. I poured every single ounce of my 40 years of business experience into this performance. I spoke about Harper, my beautiful little girl, and how much she meant to me. Then I turned my attention to him. I delivered a heartfelt, tear-jerking speech about how a father's greatest fear is leaving his daughter unprotected in a cruel world. I told the room that from the moment I met Preston, those fears completely vanished. I praised his brilliant mind, his supposed Ivy League education, and his impeccable moral character. I called him the son I never had. I watched Paul's face closely. He ate up every single word. A deeply arrogant, incredibly smug smile spread across his handsome face. He truly believed he had completely conquered me. He thought he was listening to the pathetic surrender of a beaten, senile old man handing over his entire kingdom. I raised my glass high into the air, proposing a toast to the perfect groom, and the entire room erupted into deafening applause. I sat back down, my hand shaking slightly, not from age but from the sheer effort of restraining myself from leaping across the table and strangling him. As the applause finally died down, the lights in the grand ballroom were dramatically dimmed. A large projection screen descended silently from the ceiling behind the head table. It was time for the emotional slideshow, a 20-minute montage of childhood photos and romantic memories set to soft, weeping acoustic music. Every single eye in the room turned toward the bright screen. Paul leaned forward, completely engrossed in the images of his fake, perfect life. This was my narrow window of opportunity. I leaned over to Diane and whispered softly into her ear. I told her that my stomach was feeling terribly unsettled from the rich prime rib and the champagne. I asked her if she would be all right if I slipped away to our room for a few moments to take some antacid. Diane looked at me with genuine concern, squeezing my hand gently, and told me to go rest. Harper, distracted by a picture of herself as a toddler, barely noticed me quietly standing up from my chair. I moved carefully through the darkened room, staying strictly in the shadows near the velvet-draped walls. I slipped out through the heavy mahogany doors, leaving the loud music and the 200 oblivious guests completely behind me. The moment the heavy ballroom doors clicked shut, my frail posture vanished entirely. I moved with urgent, silent precision through the empty lobby and quickly boarded the private elevator leading up to the exclusive penthouse suites. My hands were perfectly steady as I rode up to the top floor. I stepped out onto the thick carpet of the hallway and walked directly to Paul's door. Earlier that afternoon, I had slipped a crisp $100 bill to an overworked housekeeping manager, claiming I had accidentally locked my medication inside my future son-in-law's room. She had discreetly provided me with a master keycard. I pressed the plastic card against the electronic lock. The light blinked a solid green, and the heavy door clicked open. I stepped inside the luxurious penthouse and closed the door silently behind me. The suite was completely dark, save for the faint moonlight spilling through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows. The cold silence of the large room was briefly interrupted by the distant, muffled sound of the wedding band continuing to play their soft music down below. I did not dare turn on a single lamp. I pulled a small penlight from my pocket and swept the narrow beam across the living area. There, sitting perfectly centered on the sleek glass dining table, was the silver laptop. My heart leaped into my throat. I walked quickly over to the table and opened the laptop screen. It immediately demanded a complex alphanumeric password. I reached deep into my coat pocket and pulled out the small black USB drive Mitchell had sent to me via a secure courier earlier that day. It was a military-grade bypass tool designed to slice through standard encryption in seconds. I took a steadying breath, inserted the metal drive into the side port of the silver machine, and watched the dark screen flicker to life as the hidden files instantly began downloading. I pulled the small metal drive from the port of the silver laptop the moment the progress bar hit 100%. The screen went completely dark, leaving no trace of my intrusion. I slipped the drive back into my pocket, wiped the sleek surface of the machine with my handkerchief to remove any lingering fingerprints, and quietly slipped out of the penthouse suite. The hallway remained completely deserted. My heart was pounding so hard against my ribs, I thought the heavy thumping might actually wake the other guests. I made my way back down to my own suite, slipping inside and locking the heavy door firmly behind me. Diane was already fast asleep, the soft hum of her breathing machine providing a steady rhythm in the otherwise silent room. I walked over to the small desk by the window, opened my own laptop, and plugged the stolen drive into the side. The screen illuminated my face with a harsh, cold light. It was time to look the devil straight in the eye. I opened the main directory, and a massive web of complex financial folders instantly populated the screen. Mitchell was absolutely right about everything. Paul Sterling was an incredibly meticulous criminal. I clicked through the encrypted subfolders, finding the detailed ledgers of his offshore transit accounts in the Cayman Islands. Then I found exactly what I had been searching for. There, hidden inside a folder innocuously labeled as tax updates, were the finalized mortgage applications for my 4 commercial buildings in Chicago. I opened the digital files and stared at the undeniable proof of his treason. He had completely bypassed my ownership, utilizing the forged medical power of attorney to establish himself as the sole financial guardian of the estate. But what made my blood boil the hottest was seeing my daughter's signature stamped at the bottom of the loan agreements. He had manipulated Harper into unknowingly co-signing her own financial execution. The $8 million was sitting in a holding account scheduled to be automatically wired tomorrow. I finally had the concrete evidence I needed to stop the transfer and send this monster to federal prison. I leaned back in my chair, rubbing my tired eyes. I had found the smoking gun. But as I moved my cursor toward the exit button to safely eject the drive, another folder caught my attention. It was buried deep inside a directory labeled Personal Expenses. The folder was simply titled Honeymoon. I hesitated for a moment. I assumed it contained nothing more than standard flight itineraries, luxury hotel confirmations, and restaurant reservations for their upcoming trip to Italy. But the paranoid, protective instinct of a father forced my hand to click the mouse. I opened the folder. There were no travel brochures or romantic dinner bookings inside. There was only one massive digital document. The file name was a long string of alphanumeric codes, but the header of the document was terrifyingly clear. It was an expedited premium life insurance policy, and the sole insured party was my daughter Harper. My breath caught in my throat as I scrolled through the dense legal text of the policy. This was not a standard coverage plan meant to protect a young family. It was a staggering $10 million comprehensive accidental death policy. I read the fine print with growing horror. The policy had been purchased just 3 weeks ago, completely bypassing the standard medical examination requirements by paying a massive non-refundable premium upfront. But the most chilling detail was the activation clause. The $10 million coverage would become legally binding and fully active the exact second the marriage certificate was signed and notarized tomorrow. I stared at the screen, my mind struggling to process the sheer magnitude of the evil I was uncovering. Paul did not just owe the Miami cartel $8 million. He wanted to pay off his massive blood debt and still walk away with a fortune of his own. The leveraged Chicago properties were merely the immediate collateral to keep the cartel from killing him this week. My daughter's life was his actual retirement plan. My hands began to shake violently. I dug deeper into the honeymoon folder, my heart pounding a frantic, terrifying rhythm. Beneath the insurance policy, I found a hidden subfolder containing a series of saved email correspondences. They were exchanged between Paul and a private email address registered to someone simply calling themselves a local tour guide in southern Italy. I opened the first message. The subject line read, Amalfi Coast Excursions. The conversation did not discuss romantic boat tours or wine-tasting events. Paul was explicitly asking the guide about the structural stability of the ancient winding cliffside paths that overlooked the Tyrrhenian Sea. I read the words, feeling a cold, suffocating dread wash over my entire body. Paul wrote that his new bride was an incredibly adventurous photographer who loved standing near the absolute edge to get the perfect shot. He casually asked the guide which specific cliffs had the lowest structural guardrails. He asked about the typical response time for local emergency rescue services if a tragic misstep were to accidentally occur in a remote location. The guide responded with chilling professionalism, detailing a secluded completely unmonitored hiking trail near the village of Ravello that was notoriously famous for fatal tourist accidents. The guide noted that the jagged limestone rocks waiting below the terrifying 200-foot drop ensured absolutely no one survived the fall, and that local authorities always ruled these brutal incidents as simple, unavoidable tragedies. Paul had replied to that final email just yesterday morning. He wrote, "That sounds absolutely perfect. We will see you on Tuesday." The crushing realization hit me with the undeniable force of a speeding freight train. He was planning to brutally murder her. He was going to push her to her death, collect a $10 million insurance payout, and walk away as a completely free, extremely wealthy widower without consequences. I closed the laptop screen, securing the damning evidence. I checked my watch. It was nearing 11 at night. The formal dinner was winding down, transitioning into a loud after-party in the resort lounge. I slipped out of my suite, moving with a desperate urgency. I found the lounge packed with intoxicated guests laughing over loud music. Paul was standing near the massive stone fireplace, holding a fresh drink, completely surrounded by his groomsmen. Harper was sitting at a nearby corner booth, rubbing her temples, looking exhausted from the endless socializing. I walked directly up to her, keeping my face arranged in a mask of gentle, fatherly concern. I placed a hand on her bare shoulder and whispered that her mother had woken up feeling a bit disoriented and was asking for her. Harper instantly stood up, her face filled with genuine worry. Paul noticed us moving and took a step forward, his predatory eyes narrowing slightly. I gave him a warm, reassuring smile, holding up a hand to wave him off. I mouthed that Diane just needed some girl time before the big day. He nodded smoothly, taking a sip of his drink, completely unaware that his absolute nightmare had just begun. We walked silently down the long, carpeted hallway. As soon as I unlocked my door and ushered her inside, the heavy click of the deadbolt made her jump. Diane was still fast asleep in the bedroom. Harper turned to me, her brow furrowed in confusion, asking where Mom was. I did not answer her question. I walked over to the desk, opened the laptop, and turned the glowing screen to face the center of the room. I pointed to the chair. I told her to sit down. My voice was stripped of all its usual warmth. Harper hesitated, a flicker of genuine fear crossing her beautiful face. She slowly lowered herself into the chair, her eyes darting from my rigid posture to the bright screen. I leaned over her shoulder and clicked open the folder labeled Honeymoon. I did not try to soften the blow. I told her to read the document on the screen. She squinted at the dense legal text of the $10 million life insurance policy. She murmured, "Paul must have bought it to protect their future." I felt a sharp ache in my chest at her desperate, naive loyalty. I reached out and clicked on the subfolder containing the emails. I told her to read the exchange with the tour guide. I told her to read the exact date he planned to take her hiking on the unmonitored cliffs of the Amalfi Coast. I watched the exact moment the devastating truth finally broke through her absolute denial. Her eyes widened, scanning the chilling words about rescue response times and jagged limestone rocks. The color completely drained from her face. Her breath caught in her throat. She clapped both of her hands over her mouth, her eyes welling with terrified, disbelieving tears. She tried to stand up, but her legs instantly gave way. She stumbled forward, pushing past me, and bolted toward the bathroom. I followed right behind her, standing in the doorway as she collapsed over the porcelain sink, violently vomiting. Her entire body shook with loud, wretched sobs, her perfect world crumbling into absolute dust right before her eyes. She gripped the edges of the sink until her knuckles turned completely white, crying out that it had to be a mistake, that the man she loved could not possibly be planning to kill her. I did not step forward to stroke her hair. I did not offer her empty, soothing platitudes. I grabbed a clean white towel, wet it with cold water, and pressed it firmly against the back of her neck. I spoke to her with the fierce, unyielding toughness of a father who would gladly burn the entire world to the ground to keep his cubs safe. I told her to cry, to let every ounce of the betrayal out right now, because tomorrow she was going to have to fight for her life. I reminded her that she was my daughter, built from the exact same iron and concrete that created our family legacy, and she would not allow a cheap criminal to break her. Harper slowly lifted her head, splashing cold water on her tear-streaked face. She looked at her reflection in the mirror, her eyes bloodshot, and filled with a profound, agonizing heartbreak. She turned to me, her hands trembling violently as she reached into her small evening clutch. She pulled out her cell phone, her fingers hovering over the glowing keypad. She looked up at me, her voice hoarse and desperate. She said we needed to call the police right now. She wanted to have Paul arrested immediately. I reached out and gently covered her shaking hand with my own, lowering the phone away from her face. I looked directly into her tearful eyes, my expression completely resolute. I told her no. I explained that if we called the local authorities tonight, Paul would immediately sense the danger. With his vast criminal connections, he would post bail, board a private flight, and completely disappear. He would slip back into the shadows, leaving our family permanently burdened with his cartel debts and tied up in endless legal battles over the forged mortgages. We could not just scare him away. We had to completely destroy him. I wiped a stray tear from her cheek with my rough thumb. I told her she was going to have to do the hardest thing she had ever done in her entire life. She was going to put her beautiful wedding dress on, walk down to that lobby, and smile at the devil. We were not going to stop the wedding. If we call the cops, he bails out and disappears. We are going to let him sign the final papers tomorrow. I held her trembling shoulders, my grip firm enough to impart strength, but gentle enough to remind her she was not alone. I told her to go right back to the lounge, find Paul, and complain about wedding day jitters. She needed to apologize for leaving abruptly and kiss him. It was a repulsive task, asking my daughter to embrace the man planning her murder, but it was the only way to maintain the illusion of compliance. Harper took a shuddering breath, her posture slowly straightening as the terrified girl transformed into a hardened survivor. She nodded once, a cold determination settling into her bloodshot eyes. I watched her walk down the hallway, her head held high. Once she was gone, I grabbed my thick winter coat and my keys. I had a massive logistical hurdle to overcome tonight. Digital files were excellent for federal indictments, but to completely invalidate the forged mortgages and protect my properties before the deadline, I needed the original notarized legal documents. Those documents were sitting 2,000 miles away in Illinois. I waited until the lobby clock chimed midnight before I made my move. I avoided the main elevators and the grand entrance where Paul or his shadows might spot me. Instead, I used the concrete service stairwell reserved for the housekeeping staff, descending quietly to the underground parking garage. The air down there was damp and smelled heavily of exhaust. I located my rental car, slipped into the driver's seat, and kept the headlights off until I was safely out of the immediate vicinity of the hotel grounds. I merged onto the desolate mountain highway, checking my rearview mirror constantly. This time there was no black sport utility vehicle trailing behind me. They assumed the senile old man was fast asleep in his bed. I drove 30 miles from the resort to a small privately owned airfield on the Nevada border. Mitchell had called in a massive favor to arrange this transportation. A sleek charter plane was idling on the dark tarmac, its navigation lights blinking softly against the night sky. I parked the rental car behind a rusted hangar, grabbed my leather bag, and walked toward the waiting aircraft. The pilot did not ask for my name or boarding pass. He simply nodded, pulled up the metal stairs, and secured the cabin door the moment I took my seat. Within minutes, we were hurtling down the short runway and climbing steeply into the freezing stratosphere. The cabin was dark and completely silent, vibrating with the immense power of the dual engines. I stared out the small window at the sprawling, empty darkness below. My mind raced through the dangerous steps of the plan I was about to execute. I thought about Paul Sterling drinking expensive champagne in a luxury lounge on my dime, unaware that the supposed victim he had written off as a clueless burden was currently rocketing across the country to sever his financial lifeline. I felt no fear anymore. The initial shock and the devastating heartbreak had been burned away, replaced by a cold, calculating fury. I was a man who had spent 40 years building a fortress around my family, and I was fully prepared to drop the entire heavy structure directly onto his head. The 3-hour flight felt like a chaotic blur of intense adrenaline and rigid focus. As the first faint hints of dawn began to paint the horizon in streaks of bruised purple, the sprawling lights of Chicago finally appeared below us. The plane touched down smoothly on a private suburban runway located just 20 minutes from my neighborhood. A black town car was already waiting on the tarmac, another expensive detail seamlessly arranged by Mitchell. I climbed into the back seat and gave the driver my home address. We drove through the familiar quiet streets of my neighborhood, the massive oak trees bare in the biting winter chill. The neighborhood was dead silent, the neighboring houses completely dark. The driver pulled up to the curb of my property. I told him to keep the engine running and wait, promising I would be back in exactly 10 minutes. I stepped out into the freezing Chicago wind and walked rapidly up the paved driveway to my large, empty house. Diane and I had spent 30 years living within these brick walls, raising Harper and building our entire lives. Now it felt like a cold, hollow shell. I unlocked the heavy oak front door and stepped inside, leaving the overhead lights switched off to avoid drawing attention from the quiet street outside. I pulled my penlight from my coat pocket and navigated through the dark hallway, bypassing the formal living room and heading straight toward my private home office located at the very back of the first floor. I stepped into the office and securely locked the heavy wooden door behind me. The room smelled faintly of old paper and the cigars I used to smoke. I moved the beam of the flashlight across the walls, passing over framed architectural blueprints and old family photographs. I walked directly to the large mahogany desk sitting proudly in the center of the room. I did not open any of the wooden drawers. Instead, I pushed the heavy leather chair out of my way and dropped down onto my knees. I reached down to the thick Persian rug covering the hardwood floor beneath the desk. I grabbed the corner of the rug and pulled it forcefully back, revealing the smooth oak planks underneath. I ran my calloused fingers along the seemingly seamless floorboards until I found the tiny, almost invisible notch carved directly into the wood. I pressed my thumb firmly against the hidden latch, and a small square section of the floor popped open with a quiet, mechanical click. I reached into the dark void and pulled back the heavy wooden panel, exposing the cold, heavy steel dial of a large floor safe hidden deep beneath the carpet. I spun the heavy steel dial with practiced precision, the familiar metallic clicks echoing softly in the quiet darkness of the office. 30, right 15, left 42, right. The heavy bolts disengaged with a solid, satisfying thud. I grabbed the cold metal handle and pulled the thick door open. Inside, sitting neatly on the fireproof shelf, was a stack of thick red folders. I reached in and pulled out the top folder, feeling the substantial weight of the heavy parchment paper inside. This was not just a collection of standard legal documents. This was the ultimate failsafe. This was the absolute unbreakable shield I had forged 5 years ago. When Diane was first diagnosed with severe multiple sclerosis, our entire world was violently turned upside down. I watched the strongest, most vibrant woman I had ever known slowly lose her physical independence to a merciless disease. During those agonizing first few months of endless hospital visits and terrifying medical prognoses, I came to a cold, incredibly harsh realization. The massive wealth I had spent 40 years building was suddenly a glaring vulnerability. If something happened to my own cognitive abilities, or if Diane required specialized round-the-clock care that exhausted our standard insurance policies, our life savings could be rapidly depleted by predatory healthcare systems. Even worse, I knew that predators constantly circled wealthy, vulnerable families, looking for the slightest crack in the armor to drain their assets. I refused to let my family become a tragic cautionary tale. I quietly hired a specialized team of ruthless, fiercely independent corporate attorneys based out of a private firm in New York. I explicitly instructed them to bypass my local financial advisors. Together, we meticulously crafted an incredibly complex legal structure. We established an irrevocable blind trust under the name of a completely separate, highly guarded corporate entity. The beauty of an irrevocable blind trust is absolute detachment. Once the assets are transferred inside, they are permanently locked away. Even I, the original creator of the trust, legally lost the direct power to dissolve it or leverage its contents without the unanimous consent of a totally independent board of trustees. I systematically moved the authentic original deeds to all 4 of my commercial buildings in Chicago into that impenetrable vault. I transferred exactly 90% of our total liquid cash reserves into its heavily guarded accounts. By legally restructuring my entire estate, I effectively made myself a ghost on paper. But a seasoned contractor knows that if you build a fortress without a visible door, thieves will just keep hammering at the walls until they break through. You have to give them a door to pick. You have to give them a target. So I deliberately left the original family trust active. I left the old corporate name exactly the same, but I completely gutted its actual substance. I left roughly $100,000 of bait money sitting inside the liquid accounts to make it look active and legitimate. I left convincing, highly detailed copies of the commercial property deeds in the old management portal. The trust that Paul Sterling had spent the last 6 months meticulously hacking the financial accounts he had proudly transferred to his offshore transit codes, and the multi-million-dollar real estate portfolios he had aggressively leveraged to satisfy his violent cartel debt, were all completely fake. Paul had not legally mortgaged my 4 beautiful commercial buildings in Chicago. He had fraudulently used Harper's signature to take out $8 million in high-interest loans against a completely hollow dummy corporation that held absolutely zero collateral. The banking institutions that had hastily approved those massive loans were about to discover they had been completely defrauded by a ghost. And the ruthless Miami drug cartel, expecting an $8 million wire transfer by the end of the week, was going to receive absolutely nothing. Paul had walked directly into my trap, locked the door confidently behind himself, and eagerly handed me the only key. He thought he was playing a brilliant game of financial chess against a senile, clueless old man. He had absolutely no idea that the entire board he was playing on was a carefully constructed illusion designed to completely destroy him. I carefully opened the heavy red folder and silently verified all the contents. The official stamped documents proving the authentic existence of the irrevocable blind trust were perfectly intact. The true property deeds bearing the unalterable seals of the state of Illinois rested safely in my calloused hands. These papers were the ultimate weapon. They were the absolute proof I needed to invalidate every single fraudulent contract Paul planned to execute tomorrow. I carefully placed the documents into a waterproof sleeve and slipped them securely into the inner pocket of my heavy winter coat. I closed the heavy steel door of the safe, spun the dial to lock the bolts, and replaced the wooden floorboard. I rolled the thick Persian rug back over the hidden compartment, erasing any trace of my midnight visit. I walked out of the quiet, dark office, locked the front door of my Chicago home, and stepped back out into the freezing winter air. The black town car was still idling faithfully by the curb, white exhaust billowing softly into the dark street. I climbed into the back seat and told the driver to get me back to the airstrip as fast as possible. The return flight was a smooth, silent journey through the darkest hours of the early morning. I sat in the dim cabin of the private jet, my hand resting firmly over my coat pocket, feeling the solid weight of the documents against my chest. I watched through the small oval window as the deep black sky slowly began to bleed into brilliant shades of orange and gold. The bright morning sun was officially rising over the majestic snow-capped peaks of the Nevada mountains. It was finally the exact morning of the wedding. I stepped off the plane and into the interior of the waiting town car, the physical documents burning a heavy hole in my inner coat pocket. The drive back up the winding mountain roads was a blur of towering pines and blinding morning sunlight. I slipped back into the luxury resort through the same underground service entrance I had used just a few hours prior, moving like a ghost through the concrete corridors. When I finally unlocked the door to my suite, Diane was just beginning to stir. I quickly took off my heavy winter coat, carefully hiding the waterproof sleeve containing the real trust documents underneath the mattress of my bed. I changed into a fresh shirt and poured myself a cup of black coffee just as my wife opened her eyes. She smiled warmly at me, completely oblivious to the fact that I had just flown across the country and back to save our entire family from total annihilation. I kissed her forehead and told her it was time to get ready for our little girl's big day. By 9 in the morning, the entire resort was buzzing with an overwhelming, frantic energy. Massive trucks from local florists were backed up to the main terrace, unloading thousands of white roses and delicate orchids. Panicked event coordinators armed with detailed clipboards were running urgently through the carpeted hallways, shouting last-minute orders to waiters carrying heavy silver trays of crystal champagne glasses. The string quartet had already set up near the edge of the lake, practicing the soft, romantic melodies that were supposed to score my daughter's walk down the aisle. I stepped out of my suite and walked down toward the main lobby to survey the battlefield. That was the exact moment I finally saw him. Paul Sterling was standing near the grand staircase surrounded by his laughing groomsmen. He was dressed in a perfectly tailored black tuxedo, his hair immaculately styled. He looked like a man who had already won the lottery. He projected an aura of absolute untouchable triumph. He caught my eye from across the busy room and flashed me that same brilliant, predatory smile. He raised his morning cup of coffee toward me in a mock salute, silently celebrating the massive fortune he believed he was about to steal. I forced a polite nod, playing the part of the proud father one last time before turning on my heel and heading straight toward the bridal suite. I walked down the hall and knocked softly on the heavy wooden door of the bridal suite. A giggling bridesmaid opened it, rushing past me with a steamer in her hand. I stepped into the room, and the heavy wooden door clicked shut behind me, cutting off the chaotic noise of the hallway. Harper was standing in the center of the room, completely surrounded by tall mirrors. She was wearing her wedding dress. It was a breathtaking gown of white lace and silk, the exact dress she had dreamed about since she was a little girl playing in our living room in Chicago. But the woman wearing it looked like she was standing on the gallows. Her face was ashen, her breathing shallow and erratic. The makeup artists had done their best to cover the dark circles under her eyes, but they could not hide the sheer terror radiating from her entire body. As soon as the remaining bridesmaids cleared the room to fetch more champagne, Harper completely broke down. She began to shake violently, the delicate lace of her dress trembling against her skin. She reached out and grabbed my arms, whispering frantically that she could not do this. She said her chest was incredibly tight, and she felt like she was going to pass out. I stepped forward and wrapped my hands firmly around her cold, trembling fingers. I squeezed her hands tightly, grounding her to reality. I looked directly into her terrified eyes and spoke with absolute, unwavering authority. I told her that she was the strongest woman I knew. I reminded her that the man waiting downstairs was nothing more than a desperate criminal running out of time. I promised her on my own life that she would not be marrying him today. I told her to take a deep breath, lift her chin, and play her part perfectly for just one more hour. Harper closed her eyes, took a long, shuddering breath, and slowly nodded. I watched the fear in her eyes harden into a cold, brittle resolve. She wiped a stray tear from the corner of her eye, turned back to the mirror, and perfectly adjusted her white veil. I told her I would see her at the altar, gave her one final reassuring squeeze on the shoulder, and walked out of the bridal suite. The adrenaline in my veins felt like liquid ice. I marched back down the long corridor toward my own room to finalize my preparations. I needed to retrieve the red folder from beneath my mattress and wait for the exact moment Paul made his final fatal move. I entered my suite, checked on Diane, who was happily getting her hair styled by an assistant in the bathroom, and walked over to the bed. Just as my trembling fingers brushed against the edge of the hidden waterproof sleeve, a sharp, authoritative knock echoed from my suite door. I quickly straightened my posture, smoothed my vest, and walked over to open it. Standing in the doorway was Paul, still wearing his triumphant smirk, accompanied by a tall, severe-looking man holding a thick leather briefcase. Paul stepped directly into the room without waiting for an invitation. He gestured smoothly to the tall man standing quietly right beside him and spoke in a low tone that was now completely devoid of his usual manufactured warmth and fake charm. He looked me dead in the eye and said, "The final asset transfer, just a formality before the ceremony. Richard, sign here." The severe-looking lawyer strode confidently into my suite, ignoring basic manners. He walked directly to the glass dining table and unlatched his leather briefcase. The metallic clicks echoed loudly. He pulled out a stack of documents and slammed them onto the glass. He produced a pen, unscrewed the cap, and laid it next to the contracts. Paul strolled in right behind him, hands tucked into his tuxedo trousers. He leaned against the doorframe, projecting absolute control, truly believing he was dealing with a mentally declining old man oblivious to the financial slaughter. I stared down at the thick stack of papers. This was the final mechanism of his master plan. These documents were designed to bind the hollow trust to his marital estate, granting him absolute authorization to execute the 8 million loan transfers using my forged signature last time. If I signed, the money would flow to the Miami cartel by noon, and my 4 commercial buildings in Chicago would be chained to an unpayable debt. I knew exactly what was at stake, but I had to play my pathetic role until the last second. I let my shoulders slump forward, adopting the posture of a defeated, confused elder. I shuffled toward the glass table, making my hands tremble as I reached out to touch the paper. The lawyer did not bother offering me a seat. He pointed a finger at the bottom of the first page, speaking in a cold monotone. He instructed me to sign my full legal name next to the yellow sticky tabs, adding that my daughter had already provided her preliminary consent downstairs. This was the last bureaucratic hurdle before the ceremony could begin. I looked down at the pen. It looked heavy. I picked it up, letting my fingers fumble around the metal barrel. I hovered the ink nib just inches above the white paper. I kept my head bowed, playing the part of a man whose mind was clouded by advancing dementia. The room fell completely and utterly silent. They held their breath, waiting for the final stroke of the pen to secure their stolen fortune. I lifted my head and turned my gaze toward Paul. He was watching me with predatory anticipation. The polite facade he wore for my family was cracking, revealing the desperate criminal hiding underneath. His dark eyes were fixed on my trembling hand, willing the pen to touch the paper. I let out a soft, wavering sigh. I pitched my voice, making it sound fragile and filled with heartbreaking uncertainty. I asked him if this was truly the right thing to do. I told him I had spent my entire life building this wealth to keep my wife and my little girl safe. I asked him, my voice cracking with manufactured emotion, "Are you absolutely sure this will protect my family?" Paul pushed himself off the doorframe and took a slow, confident step toward me. He looked deeply into my eyes, summoning every ounce of his deceptive charm. His face softened into a mask of pure devotion. He placed his hand over his heart, acting like a noble protector, taking a solemn oath before God. He smiled, that same brilliant, flawless smile that had completely fooled my daughter for the past 2 years. He spoke in a voice that was incredibly smooth, dripping with absolute sincerity and unwavering conviction. He said, "With my life, Dad, I promise you I will take care of everything from here on out. You never have to worry about a single thing ever again." It was the most chilling lie I had ever heard. He delivered it without a single flinch, without a microscopic trace of hesitation. He was standing there wearing a custom tuxedo paid for with my money, promising to protect my family on the same day he had planned to throw my only child off a jagged cliff in Italy for a $10 million insurance payout. A strange, powerful sensation began to spread through my veins. It was not fear. It was not panic. It was the absolute certainty of victory. The adrenaline I had been suppressing finally surged, burning away the frail, trembling facade I had been maintaining. I looked down at the pen resting in my right hand. I held it perfectly still over the signature line for 5 agonizing seconds. The lawyer shifted his weight impatiently. Paul took another step forward, his jaw clenching slightly, and then I simply let go. The heavy pen slipped from my fingers and clattered loudly against the solid glass tabletop. It rolled off the smooth edge and hit the carpeted floor with a dull thud. I did not reach down to pick it up. Instead, I slowly straightened my spine. The artificial hunch in my shoulders vanished. The trembling in my calloused hands stopped instantly. I stood up to my full, imposing height, forcing both the lawyer and Paul to take a step back from the sudden shift in my presence. I looked directly at Paul, the frail confusion gone from my eyes. I let out a deep, echoing laugh that started low in my chest and filled the entire suite. It was a dark, chilling sound completely devoid of humor. It was the sound of a seasoned predator finally springing an inescapable trap. Paul's triumphant smile vanished, replaced by a look of sheer confusion. He stared at me, his mind desperately trying to comprehend the sudden transformation unfolding before his eyes. I did not need to say a single word to him. I simply turned around, walked calmly over to the large king-sized bed, and reached my hand deep underneath the heavy mattress. I pulled out the thick, waterproof sleeve I had hidden there just an hour ago. I unzipped the top and pulled out my own stack of authentic legal documents. I held the bright red folder tightly in my hand, turned back to face the 2 stunned men, and prepared to drop the sky right on their heads. I stepped forward, moving with the heavy, deliberate steps of a man who owned the very ground he walked on. The lawyer instinctively took another step backward, clutching his leather briefcase against his chest like a useless shield. Preston stood completely frozen, his dark eyes darting between my suddenly steady hands and the thick red folder I was holding. I walked directly over to the glass dining table standing over the fraudulent contracts they had just demanded I sign. I did not break eye contact with Preston as I raised the red folder and let it drop onto the glass. The heavy folder hit the smooth glass tabletop with a loud, resounding smack that echoed throughout the quiet hotel suite. I reached out with a perfectly calm hand and slowly flipped the thick cover open. I pulled out the crisp, officially stamped parchment papers bearing the unmistakable seals of the state of Illinois and the signatures of the New York Board of Trustees. I carefully arranged them across the table, fanning them out, like a winning hand of poker right next to his worthless forged documents. I looked up at Preston and spoke in a voice edged with cold steel. I told him that an amateur builds a house by simply laying bricks on top of the dirt, hoping the wind never blows too hard. But a master builder digs deep into the earth. He pours a foundation of solid, reinforced concrete that cannot be moved, cannot be broken, and absolutely cannot be stolen by cheap thieves slipping through the back door. I pointed a steady finger at the authentic documents resting on the glass. I explained to him that 5 years ago, when my wife first became severely ill, I recognized the immense vulnerability of our vast accumulated wealth. I knew that financial vultures always circle the weak. So I took every single piece of actual value I owned, including the authentic deeds to my 4 commercial buildings in Chicago, and exactly 90% of my liquid cash, and I permanently locked them inside an irrevocable blind trust under a completely different corporate entity. I told him I did not even have the legal authority to leverage those assets today, let alone sign them over to a newly minted son-in-law armed with a forged medical power of attorney. I watched his handsome, pale face very, very closely. The arrogant, untouchable smirk that had lived on his lips for the past 2 years began to violently twitch. His flawless posture stiffened as the first cold realization of his massive failure began to wash over him. He looked down at the documents, his eyes rapidly scanning the dense legal text, desperately searching for a loophole that simply did not exist. I leaned forward, resting both of my hands firmly on the edge of the glass table, bringing my weathered face just inches from his. I lowered my voice to a terrifying, deadly whisper and delivered the final crushing blow. You didn't mortgage my buildings, Preston. You forged documents to mortgage a dummy corporation. You stole $100,000 of bait money. The silence that followed was absolute and suffocating. It was the sound of a man plummeting into a bottomless abyss. All the color instantly drained from his face, leaving him looking like a pale, terrified ghost. The polished Ivy League financial consultant completely evaporated, replaced by the desperate, cornered Miami money launderer, who was now staring directly at his own execution. He knew exactly what this meant for his immediate future and his own fragile physical safety. The massive $8 million loans he thought he had successfully secured using my spotless credit history were completely fraudulent. The banking institutions would instantly recognize the dummy corporation had zero collateral to back the massive loans. The escrow accounts holding the funds would be immediately frozen and recalled by the federal investigators. The wire transfer scheduled to be sent to the South American cartel by noon today was never going to happen. The severe lawyer suddenly realized he was standing right in the middle of a massive federal fraud scheme and began to frantically gather his heavy leather briefcases. His hands were shaking so violently he dropped several pens onto the carpeted floor. He stammered something completely incoherent about attorney-client privilege and rushed toward the door of the suite, desperate to distance himself from the rapidly sinking ship. Preston did not even try to stop him. He remained glued to the spot, his breathing becoming shallow and incredibly rapid. The devastating reality of his situation was finally crushing him under its immense weight. Without my assets, he had absolutely no way to pay his blood debt. The men he owed money to did not accept any hollow apologies. They certainly did not grant extensions, and they would not be merciful. A dark, primal rage suddenly flared in his hollow eyes. The charming mask completely shattered, revealing the violent monster underneath. He snarled, curling his hands into tight fists. He took a menacing, aggressive step toward me, his chest heaving with desperate fury. He looked like a wild, cornered animal, ready to tear my throat out simply because he had absolutely nothing left to lose. He raised his voice, shouting that I had ruined everything, that I had just signed both of our absolute death warrants here today. He demanded I call my lawyers right now and reverse the blind trust, threatening to physically force me to sign the authorizations if I refused. He thought physical intimidation could still save him. But I did not flinch. I did not take a single step backward. I just stood there staring at the pathetic, broken man who had planned to throw my precious daughter off an Italian cliff for insurance money. I let him snarl and posture, secure in the knowledge that his pathetic threats were completely useless. He thought the worst was over. But I was not done yet. I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored suit jacket, keeping my eyes locked firmly on his sweating face. I pulled out my cell phone and the black metal bypass drive I had utilized in his penthouse the night before. I placed the metal drive onto the glass table, setting it right next to the authentic trust documents. I tapped my phone screen, opened my voice memos, and turned the volume to its maximum limit. I pressed play. The pristine audio of our private balcony conversation from the previous evening instantly filled the heavy silence of the hotel room. My own voice echoed first, asking him directly about the sudden transfer of the family wealth. Then his deeply arrogant voice answered, lying flawlessly, about the Delaware holding company and the capital gains tax. I let the recording play long enough for him to hear his own confident voice happily admitting to legally restructuring my assets without my informed consent. I paused the audio track and looked back up at him. I explained calmly that the recording was undeniable evidence of his premeditated intent to defraud my family. It explicitly proved he knowingly lied about the final destination of the massive funds and manipulated the complex transfer protocols under totally false pretenses. But that was only the financial side of his unforgivable betrayal. I slowly picked up the small black drive from the glass table and held it up between my thumb and forefinger for him to clearly see. I told him this little device contained a complete unencrypted clone of his personal laptop hard drive. I watched his dark eyes widen in horror as I began to meticulously list his closely guarded secrets. I called him by his real name, Paul Sterling. I mentioned his disastrously failed cryptocurrency venture in Miami. I told him I knew absolutely everything about the $8 million he owed to a deeply unforgiving South American narcotics cartel. He took another unsteady step back, hitting the dining chair with the back of his knees. His breathing was so incredibly loud, it sounded like he was physically suffocating right in the middle of the room. But the deepest, most devastating cut was still to come. I stepped closer to him, my voice completely devoid of any human mercy. I told him I had also found the hidden folder labeled Honeymoon. I told him I had read every single line of the $10 million accidental death insurance policy he had recently purchased for my beautiful daughter. I quoted the exact horrifying emails he had exchanged with the shadowy tour guide in Italy, casually discussing the jagged limestone rocks and the tragically slow emergency response times on the remote cliffs of the Amalfi Coast. I told him my daughter had read those exact same emails last night in this very room. I told him she knew absolutely everything about his sick, twisted plan. She was not a naive, helpless bride waiting for him downstairs by the lake. She was a hardened survivor who had just spent the entire morning watching him march blindly toward his own spectacular, unavoidable destruction. The knowledge that his perfect victim had completely seen through his monstrous disguise finally broke him. The arrogant, composed financial genius was completely gone. The cornered, desperate street criminal from Miami fully took over his body. He let out a raw, guttural scream of absolute, unadulterated rage. He finally realized he had no stolen money to pay the violent cartel, no innocent bride to murder for an insurance payout, and no legal leverage to protect himself from spending decades in a federal penitentiary. His dark survival instincts instantly overrode whatever rational thought he had left. He dropped the nice guy act entirely. He lunged violently across the short space separating us, his large hands reaching directly for my throat. He was decades younger and significantly faster than I was. His heavy shoulder slammed directly into my chest with incredible force, knocking the breath completely out of my lungs. We crashed hard against the sharp edge of the glass dining table, sending the fraudulent legal contracts and my cell phone scattering wildly across the carpeted floor. He violently pinned me against the edge of the heavy table, his strong fingers desperately clawing at my neck. His handsome face twisted into an ugly mask of pure murderous hatred. He shouted wildly that he was going to kill me right here, that he was going to tear my entire life apart with his own bare hands. I quickly brought my forearms up, using every ounce of physical strength I had built over 40 years of manual labor to block his strikes. My aging muscles burned intensely, and my spine screamed in sudden agony, but I stubbornly held my ground against the wild, uncoordinated assault. I knew I only needed to hold him off for a few brief seconds. I had carefully planned for this exact violent reaction. I knew a terrified animal would always attack when backed into a corner, with absolutely nowhere left to run. He raised his right fist high into the air, preparing to deliver a devastating, fatal blow directly to my face. I braced myself for the incoming impact, tightening my jaw and keeping my eyes wide open. But the crushing blow never landed. A deafening, explosive crash suddenly shattered the violent chaos in the room. The heavy wooden doors of my suite did not just open, they burst inward with tremendous force, the thick metal hinges violently tearing straight out of the doorframe. The wood splintered loudly, sending sharp fragments scattering across the entryway floor. Preston froze his fist suspended in the air, his head snapping toward the ruined doorway in absolute panic. It was not the hotel management, and it certainly was not the local resort security rushing in to break up a family dispute. The people standing in that shattered doorway had not come to peacefully negotiate. They had come for absolute blood. Through the shattered, splintering frame of the wooden doorway stepped Mitchell Thorne. He did not look like the exhausted, chain-smoking private investigator I had spoken to on the burner phone just yesterday morning. He wore a heavy, dark tactical jacket, and his face was set in a mask of absolute professional stone. But he was not the reason Preston stopped his violent assault. Flooding into the room directly behind Mitchell were 4 heavily armed federal agents, wearing thick Kevlar vests adorned with the bold yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. They moved with terrifying coordinated precision, their tactical boots loudly crushing the scattered wooden splinters against the plush hotel carpet. They completely filled the luxurious space instantly, transforming the elegant bridal suite into an active, highly volatile crime scene. The lead agent, a massive man with a booming, authoritative voice, immediately began shouting a continuous stream of deafening commands. He ordered everyone in the room to freeze and show their hands. Preston was still leaning over me, his fingers rigidly hovering near my throat, his mind completely incapable of processing the sudden, overwhelming presence of federal law enforcement. That momentary hesitation was his ultimate undoing. 2 of the armed agents lunged forward across the room. They grabbed Preston by the shoulders of his custom-tailored midnight blue tuxedo and violently ripped him completely off my chest. They spun him around with brutal, unforgiving force and slammed him face first against the reinforced plaster wall of the suite. The impact was incredibly loud. A heavy gold-framed mirror hanging on the wall dislodged from its metal hook and crashed to the floor, shattering into 1,000 jagged pieces around his polished leather shoes. The pristine fabric of his expensive tuxedo jacket tore violently at the seams as the agents aggressively pinned his arms behind his back. Preston let out a muffled grunt of pain, his cheek pressed firmly against the floral wallpaper. All the smooth, arrogant grace he possessed was entirely stripped away, leaving only a struggling, frantic criminal being physically subdued by the overwhelming power of the United States government. He tried to squirm, kicking his legs out in a desperate, futile attempt to find leverage, but the agents drove their knees sharply into the backs of his thighs, forcing him to instantly collapse toward the floor. The sharp, metallic ratcheting sound of heavy steel handcuffs locking tightly around his wrists echoed crisply through the room. While Preston was being neutralized against the wall, the severe lawyer suddenly realized the catastrophic magnitude of the situation. He recognized that he was not just caught in a family dispute, but actively participating in a massive federal sting operation. Complete panic washed over his face. He dropped his expensive leather briefcase, sending a cascade of fraudulent legal documents spilling wildly across the floor, and bolted directly toward the shattered doorway. He moved with the desperate, uncoordinated franticness of a frightened rabbit. But he did not even make it 3 steps. The 4th federal agent seamlessly stepped into his path, grabbed the lapels of his gray suit, and effortlessly threw him hard against the carpeted floor. The lawyer hit the ground with a pathetic, breathless wheeze, immediately burying his face into his hands and loudly sobbing that he had absolutely no idea what his client was planning to do. Mitchell Thorne walked slowly across the chaotic room, ignoring the sobbing lawyer, and extended a strong hand down toward me. I grabbed his forearm, and he hoisted me up from the edge of the glass dining table. My back ached terribly, and my breathing was still slightly ragged from the sudden physical exertion, but I nodded at Mitchell to let him know I was perfectly fine. Mitchell looked down at the scattered authentic trust documents and the black metal bypass drive resting safely on the table. He offered me a grim, respectful smile, silently acknowledging that the trap I had set had functioned with absolute devastating perfection. Then he slowly turned his attention toward the man pinned against the wall. The lad federal agent stepped back, allowing his partner to drag Preston up from his knees. Preston was breathing heavily, his dark hair falling wildly across his sweating forehead. A thin line of blood trickled down his chin from where his face had impacted the wall. He glared at me with absolute unfiltered venom, his chest heaving. The lead agent pulled a folded piece of white paper from his tactical vest and began to read aloud. His booming voice filled the room, methodically listing the formal federal charges. He announced they possessed a signed judicial warrant for the immediate arrest of Paul Sterling. He listed multiple counts of severe wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and the deliberate falsification of federal banking documents across state lines. Preston closed his eyes, his jaw clenching so tightly I thought his teeth might shatter. He knew those financial charges alone carried decades in federal prison. But the agent was not finished reading. The agent took a deep breath, looked directly into Preston's eyes, and announced the final most devastating charge on the federal warrant. He stated they were officially charging him with the premeditated conspiracy to commit murder across international borders, citing the newly acquired life insurance policy and the documented digital communications outlining the lethal plot on the Amalfi Coast. The mention of the murder charge drained the very last ounce of fight completely out of Preston. His knees buckled slightly, and the two agents had to physically hold him up by his torn tuxedo jacket. He fully realized that he was not just going to prison for stealing money. He was going to be locked in a maximum security federal penitentiary for the rest of his natural life. And even worse, he knew that the moment he was processed into the federal system, the violent Miami cartel he owed $8 million to would instantly know exactly where to find him. He was a completely dead man, walking trapped inside a steel cage with absolutely no money, no leverage, and no place left to hide. The brilliant financial consultant was gone forever, completely erased by his own monumental greed. The two federal agents roughly hauled Paul Sterling up from the carpeted floor of my suite. His legs were visibly shaking, barely able to support his own body weight. The immaculate midnight blue tuxedo, which he had proudly worn just a few hours ago as a symbol of his impending triumph, was now torn at the shoulders and stained with the dust of the ruined doorway. His wrists were bound tightly behind his back by heavy steel handcuffs that bit deeply into his skin with every frantic movement. Mitchell Thorne stepped aside, his face a mask of cold, professional satisfaction, allowing the armed agents to march their prisoner out of the devastated room. The severe lawyer was dragged out right behind him, weeping silently, completely broken by the sudden destruction of his corrupt career. I did not follow them immediately. I took a slow, deep breath, smoothing the lapels of my suit jacket, and walked out into the hallway, following the heavy boots of the federal team as they escorted the criminal toward the glass elevator that descended directly into the main lobby of the resort. The grand lobby was a breathtaking vision of luxurious wedding preparations. Over 200 of our closest friends, extended family members, and wealthy business associates were gathered beneath the massive crystal chandeliers. They were dressed in their absolute best, holding fluted glasses of expensive champagne, laughing warmly as a professional string quartet played a soft, romantic melody near the grand staircase. The atmosphere was incredibly joyous, filled with the vibrant anticipation of a beautiful marriage ceremony. But the exact moment the polished steel doors of the glass elevator slid open, the romantic music abruptly died. The lead federal agent stepped out into the crowded lobby, his hand resting firmly on the grip of his holstered weapon, loudly shouting for the bewildered guests to clear a path. A collective, horrifying gasp rippled through the massive room. 200 pairs of eyes instantly locked onto the shocking spectacle unfolding before them. The flawless, charming groom they had all toasted just last night was being forcefully paraded through the center of his own wedding reception like a captured animal. The luxurious crowd physically recoiled, parting like the Red Sea as the armed agents marched Paul across the pristine marble floor. Elite financial advisors, proud aunts, and smiling cousins stared in absolute paralyzed disbelief. The whispers started instantly, a frantic hissing wave of confusion and terror spreading through the room. Paul kept his head lowered at first, desperately trying to hide his bleeding chin and his profound humiliation from the wealthy people he had spent 2 years effortlessly manipulating. But the heavy, oppressive silence of the shocked crowd suddenly seemed to snap the final remaining thread of his sanity. He violently jerked his shoulders against the grip of the federal agents and threw his head back, his wild, bloodshot eyes frantically scanning the upper levels of the resort. He found me standing perfectly still on the second-floor mezzanine balcony, looking down at him from above. The polished facade completely disintegrated, leaving nothing but a terrified man staring into the face of his own mortality. He stopped fighting the agents and began to scream, His raw voice echoed loudly off the marble walls, completely devoid of dignity. He begged me to help him. He screamed that I had to give him the money, sobbing that federal prison was not what he truly feared. In front of 200 stunned guests, he shrieked about the Miami cartel. He wailed that the men he owed $8 million to would know exactly what happened today. He screamed they had eyes everywhere. They would find out the transfer failed, and they would have him slaughtered before he reached a courtroom. He cried that I was sentencing him to death, pleading for me to sign the authentic documents and wire the funds to save his life. He offered to disappear forever, to never look at my daughter again, if I would just pay his blood debt. I stood perfectly still on the marble balcony, my hands resting casually on the ornate brass railing. I looked down at the screaming, sobbing creature who had meticulously planned to throw my only child off a jagged Italian cliff for a massive insurance payout. I felt absolutely no pity. I felt no remorse. I reached slowly into the breast pocket of my suit jacket and pulled out a thick, hand-rolled Cuban cigar I had been saving for a very special occasion. I placed it between my lips, retrieved a silver lighter, and struck the flint. The small, bright flame illuminated my cold, indifferent eyes. I took a slow, deep draw, letting the rich, heavy smoke completely fill my lungs before exhaling a thick, white cloud over the balcony railing. I did not say a single word to him. I simply watched him through the drifting smoke as the disgusted federal agents finally lost their patience, violently shoving him forward and dragging him forcefully through the heavy glass doors of the resort entrance. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the lobby, the wedding party watched in stunned silence as Paul Sterling was thrown into the back of an armored federal transport vehicle. The heavy steel doors slammed shut with a definitive ringing thud that echoed through the thick glass. The emergency lights flashed brilliantly against the snow-capped mountain peaks as the convoy sped away down the winding highway, disappearing completely from our lives forever. The massive lobby remained dead silent. Not even a single guest moved. Champagne flutes were frozen in their hands, their faces pale with shock and horrifying confusion. They desperately needed answers. I took one final satisfying drag from my cigar, crushed the burning ember out in a nearby silver ashtray, and slowly turned away from the balcony edge. I adjusted my tie, squared my shoulders, and began my deliberate descent down the sweeping grand staircase to address the frozen crowd. I descended the sweeping grand staircase with slow, measured steps. The luxurious marble lobby was completely silent, save for the faint, nervous rustling of expensive silk gowns and the distant sound of the federal transport vehicle speeding away down the mountain highway. Over 200 guests stood frozen in place, their faces pale masks of absolute shock. They looked up at me as I reached the bottom step, desperately waiting for an explanation that could somehow make sense of the horrifying spectacle they had just witnessed. I walked directly toward the center of the room, my posture straight, my shoulders squared. I did not offer them a long, complicated legal explanation or a dramatic retelling of the criminal conspiracy. I simply looked out over the sea of familiar faces and raised my hands in a gesture of calm reassurance. I spoke in a clear, unwavering voice that carried easily across the massive, silent room. I told them that the man who called himself Preston Caldwell was not the man we believed him to be. I explained that he was a highly dangerous fraud who had attempted to steal our family legacy and compromise our absolute safety. I announced with a profound sense of finality that the wedding was officially canceled. A collective, breathless murmur rippled through the crowd. But before the panic could truly set in, I offered them a warm, genuine smile. I told them that while there would be no marriage ceremony today, the beautiful venue was already completely paid, for the exquisite food was already prepared, and the premium open bar was fully stocked. I invited every single one of them to stay to celebrate the absolute blessing of our continued safety and to enjoy a wonderful weekend in the mountains on me. The tense, suffocating atmosphere in the room instantly began to break. A few of my older business associates started clapping, and soon a wave of relieved applause washed over the lobby. The string quartet, taking their cue, tentatively began to play an upbeat, joyful melody. But my attention was no longer on the crowd. Through the parting sea of guests, I saw my daughter running toward me. Harper had abandoned her beautiful white lace veil somewhere along the way. She crashed into my chest, wrapping her arms tightly around my neck. The stoic, hardened survivor facade she had maintained all morning finally shattered. She buried her face in my shoulder and began to cry. They were not tears of heartbreak or sorrow. They were heavy, gasping tears of absolute, profound relief. She clung to me, her body shaking, as the crushing weight of the past 24 hours completely lifted from her shoulders. I wrapped my arms around her, burying my face in her hair, holding her exactly the way I did when she was a little girl waking up from a terrible nightmare. I whispered that it was completely over, that the monster was gone, and that he could never hurt her again. We stood together there in the middle of the crowded lobby, holding each other perfectly safe. After a long moment, Harper slowly pulled back, wiping her tear-streaked face and giving me a weak, beautiful smile. I kissed her cheek and turned my attention toward the corner of the room. My wife Diane was sitting in her wheelchair, her gentle face filled with deep confusion and worry. I walked over to her, kneeling down on the polished marble floor, so I was directly at eye level with her. I gently took both of her frail hands in my own. She looked at me, her eyes searching my face for answers, asking what had happened to the perfect young man we had welcomed into our home. I did not burden her with the terrifying details of the cartel or the Italian cliffs. I simply smiled, brushed a soft lock of hair behind her ear, and told her that he was a very bad man who had tried to trick us, but I had sent him far away. I leaned forward, pressing a soft, lingering kiss to her forehead. I promised her with every ounce of love in my heart that as long as I had breath in my lungs, absolutely nothing would ever harm our family. She smiled, her eyes shining with absolute trust, and squeezed my calloused hands. I stood up and looked around the beautiful, bustling room. My beautiful family was smiling. My financial legacy was completely secure. I took a deep breath, reflecting on the heavy burden of what it truly means to be a protector. For 40 years, I believed that my greatest achievement was building massive commercial skyscrapers out of steel and concrete in the freezing Chicago winters. I thought financial wealth was the ultimate shield against the cruelties of the world. But standing in that lobby, I realized the absolute truth. The money was completely meaningless without the strength to defend the people who depended on it. I did not just save my commercial bank accounts today. I saved my beautiful daughter's precious life. I permanently saved my wife's critical medical security. I proved that being an old man does not automatically make you a naive, helpless victim waiting to be slaughtered by the younger generation. Wisdom, patience, and the cold, calculating instincts forged by decades of hard work are weapons that no Ivy League con artist can ever anticipate or defeat. I had built a fortress around my family, and when the enemy somehow managed to sneak inside the gates, I did not panic. I simply locked the heavy doors, turned around, and completely destroyed him in the dark. Sometimes the wolf wears a tuxedo and calls you dad, but this old dog still had his teeth. What would you have done in my place? Let me know in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this story so others can learn to protect their families. See you in the next video.